The old gods have all been cast out of Israel, and all the land worships only Yahweh. The mountaintop altars and shrines have all been removed, and only the priests descended from Aaron are allowed to make offerings to the Almighty God, and they do so only in his temple in Jerusalem. Child sacrifice has been abolished, and all of Israel was united. But that's a much later narrative, and these stories found in Judges are derived from much older traditions. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. Our next judge in line is Gideon. As soon as Deborah was dead, the entire nation of Israel immediately reverted to polytheism, which of course angered Yahweh, so he sent the Midianites to conquer them. And when the people begged for mercy, Yahweh paid a visit to a man named Gideon. Now, some texts state that this was an angel of Yahweh, but even those contain the passage in Judges 6:14 that state, Yahweh turned to him, indicating that originally this was a story of a personal visit from Yahweh, and the redactors forgot to change every mention of him into an angel. Gideon offers Yahweh a sacrifice of unleavened bread, broth, and a slaughtered goat, which he places on a rock. Now, if you remember the instructions from previous books, no one outside the temple priests are supposed to make offerings to Yahweh, and certainly no personal altars are to be used. Yet here's Gideon doing exactly that, because this story comes from a time when personal altars were the norm, and we'll see more examples of that later in the book. Verse 21 states that Yahweh, not his angel, touched the sacrifice with his staff, and it burst into flames, which convinced Gideon that this was indeed a divine visitation. He then cries out, I have seen Yahweh face to face. There must be a note of panic in his voice, because Yahweh is quick to calm him, stating that all is well, and there's no need to fear, and that he will not die. Since people are allowed to see angels, and only the face of Yahweh will cause instant death, this scene makes no sense at all unless it's a personal visitation from Yahweh, which the redactors have tried to change into an angel. There's also the statement, I have seen Yahweh face to face, which is sort of a dead giveaway. Yahweh then instructs Gideon to take 2 bulls and use them to pull down the nearby altar to Baal and the Asherah poles, and in their place, construct an altar to Yahweh. That night, Gideon did as instructed, which angered the townspeople who arrived the next day to lynch him. At that point, Gideon's father tells the mob, let Baal contend with him since he tore down his altar. So instead of killing him, they renamed him Jerubbaal, which means contends with Baal. This particular story serves 2 purposes. First, it illustrates the switch from Baal worship to Yahweh worship. As the new god grew in popularity, the old lost favor and its temples were replaced. The second purpose is to co-opt Gideon as a servant of Yahweh. The name Jerubbaal doesn't mean contends with Baal. It means Baal is great. He was originally a folk hero of Baal, but that too has changed with the rise of Yahwism. Gideon then raises an army to defeat the enemies of Israel, but Yahweh tells him he wishes to claim glory for himself, so Gideon must send away any soldier who was afraid, thus losing 22,000 of his men. With only 10,000 remaining, Yahweh says it's still too many, so he decides to separate them based on how they drink water. Those who lap up water like dogs are sent to fight, while those who scoop it up in their hands are sent home, leaving only 300 fighting men. Gideon is afraid to fight with so few people, so Yahweh tells him to sneak over to the Midianite camp after dark and listen to the men. When he does so, Gideon overhears a man recounting a dream about a loaf of bread whirling through the Midianite camp, where it struck a tent and caused the tent to fall over. Another Midianite soldier exclaims, that can only mean the sword of the Israelite Gideon. Yahweh is delivering Midian and the entire camp into his hands. How exactly they got that meaning from a dream about a loaf of bread is never explained. But what is clear is that this scene is obviously invented as the Midianite soldiers speak from the point of view of an Israelite, referring to the camp as the Midianite camp instead of our camp. Armed with the knowledge that the enemy is already afraid, Gideon has his small army rush in from three sides, brandishing torches and making a huge racket so the Midianites believe they're facing an entire army instead of only 300 people. And thus they flee in terror without ever seeing the Israelites or any whirling loaves of bread. While Gideon is chasing after the enemy, he stops by the town of Succoth to ask for food for his small army, but the officials there mock him by asking if the enemy kings have been captured yet. Embarrassed, Gideon leaves. At the town of Penuel, the same occurs, so Gideon threatens to destroy their tower upon his return. He eventually catches up to the army of 15,000, which we are told is all that remains of the original army of 120,000 men, and Gideon throws them all into disarray with his 300 soldiers, allowing him to capture the two fugitive kings. He also captures a boy from the town of Succoth and interrogates him, discovering the names of the elders who run that town. On his way back, he stops by the town of Succoth and produces the two fugitive kings to the people who had mocked him earlier, and then he attacks the elders of the town, beating them with thorns as punishment for mocking him. If that wasn't bad enough, he detours to Penuel, destroys the tower there, and kills everyone inside the town because the guards on the wall had mocked him earlier. Gideon then gathers up gold from his men and has it melted down and turned into an ephod, which is a magical breastplate worn by the temple priest. Again, this is supposed to be a unique item. But, like the altar, this hints at a time when such items were numerous and in the control of locals instead of a centralized temple. He had 70 sons with his many wives and his concubines, and one of those sons, a man named Abimelech, would become the next judge. As soon as Gideon died, the entire nation of Israel began worshiping Baal Baruth, also called El Baruth, which means Lord of the Covenant or God of the Covenant, two titles which will also be borrowed by Yahweh. Abimelech starts off his tale by letting us know he's a villain. He gathers some ruffians and murders 68 of his brothers. His youngest brother, Jotham, escapes and goes into hiding. No reason for this is ever given, but soon after, Abimelech is pronounced king at Shechem. His youngest brother issues a thinly veiled curse stating that if Abimelech has acted honorably in slaughtering his siblings, then all will be well with him and Shechem, but if not, then may fire consume him. After this, Jotham wisely fled the city and went into hiding once more. After 3 years of rule, Yahweh started his interference by sowing discord between the king and his citizens, so that the citizens of Shechem began attacking the men who helped Abimelech kill his brothers. After several failed revolts in which Abimelech defeated rival armies, he had a millstone dropped on his head by a woman in a tower. So that he wouldn't die at the hands of a woman, he got one of his servants to shank him. This apparently was to fulfill the curse placed on him by his younger brother. The only thing of note concerning King Abimelech is that he is probably the same Abimelech mentioned twice in the book of Genesis. His first appearance was when Abraham pimped his wife to the man in Genesis 20, and his second was when Isaac did the same thing in Genesis 26. He was obviously a despicable ruler who inspired loathing in his subjects, so it wouldn't be a stretch to imagine people creating stories in which he's the villain. And since the stories of Judges come from oral traditions that predate the final version of Genesis, those stories could easily find their way into alternate versions of their history, just as the protagonist of those stories changes from Abraham to Isaac in the telling, who led Israel for 23 years and then died. It's pretty much the same with Jair, who led 22 years and had 30 sons and then died. Once again, all of Israel began worshiping Baal and Asherah, and also the gods of Aram, Sidon, Moab, the Ammonites, and the Philistines. So Yahweh sends the Philistines to conquer them. The Israelites then ask for help, but Yahweh rejects them. So they remove their alien gods from the land and ask again. This time, Yahweh agrees to help. At this point in the story, the Ammonites are camped outside of the city of Gilead, and the Israelites decide that whoever is the first to fight the Ammonites will rule Israel. So a man named Jephthah goes to speak with the Ammonites to ask why they're attacking. They tell him they're only taking back the lands that the Israelites stole from them. Jephthah then made a vow to Yahweh that if he helped him defeat the Ammonites, he would sacrifice the first thing that stepped out of his house upon his return home. Of course, as a reader, we can see that this is setting up for disaster, because things like goats and cows don't live inside of houses. Jephthah wins the battle with the Ammonites, and upon his return home, the first thing that walks out of his house is his only daughter. At this point, you're probably asking yourself, who did he think was going to walk out of his house? Well, it had to be his daughter who was sacrificed to Yahweh, because her death, or rather her going away party with friends, is the ostensible cause for a festival for young women in Israel. Let me explain. It's a common practice in ancient cultures to invent a legendary singular event that serves as the foundation for an annual event. Think of Christmas or Easter or virtually any other holiday. We have the origin stories for these holidays, but we also have records of these winter solstice and spring equinox festivals dating back 1,000 years or more prior to their founding dates. Another good example would be the Jewish Passover. We have an entire chapter in Exodus devoted to explaining how this custom came about, yet we know that this was a celebration that had gone on for thousands of years in ancient Canaan before this story was ever invented. And if you need a reminder about it, check episode 18, Pagan Passover, for more details. The story of Jephthah's daughter is no different. In the ancient Near East, there were annual festivals of maidenhood. Women would go to some special place outside of town, probably a sacred grove or a hilltop shrine, and spend 4 days with women they knew, chanting and singing. The practice may have originated with the worship of a fertility goddess, but it eventually got a new origin story with the advent of monotheism. In it, Jephthah's daughter is the subject, and she asks her father for time to mourn the fact that she's going to die before she has a chance to be married off to some shepherd. So, she goes off with her friends to the woods for 2 months to mourn her maidenhood. After that, she returns home, where her father promptly incinerates her in accordance with Yahweh's wishes. The end of chapter 11 then states that this is the reason Israel's maidens practice this 4-day ritual in which they go into the wilderness and chant dirges for the daughter of Jephthah every year. Of course, this origin story makes no sense. Jephthah's daughter wouldn't have cared much about not having a husband. Her mind probably would have been occupied with the thoughts of being burned alive as a child sacrifice to a Midianite war god. It should also be noted here that once again, Yahweh is commanding and accepting child sacrifice. Child sacrifice was common in North Africa and the Middle East, and burning children was the preferred method when making offerings to Shamash, the horned god of the Ammonites that Jephthah was fighting, as well as the Moabites. The god Shamash appears multiple times in the Old Testament, including a difficult passage in 2 Kings chapter 3, in which the Israelites, who are fighting alongside Yahweh, are on the verge of crushing the Moabites when the Moabite king sacrifices his firstborn son to his national god. This enables the king to call down the horned god's wrath upon Yahweh and the Israelites, which turns the tide of the battle and sends them back to their own lands. It seems that the repeated attempts of the biblical authors to decry the abhorrent practices of the Ammonites and the Moabites is done to disassociate their own child sacrifices offered to Yahweh. After the sacrifice of his daughter, the Ephraimites asked Jephthah why he didn't invite them to the battle. He claims that he did, but they failed to show up. This must have offended Jephthah for some reason, because we're told in Judges 12:4-6 that he gathered his soldiers and attacked his fellow countrymen, killing 42,000 of them for no apparent reason. The text gives no reason for this war between two supposedly tight-knit tribes. But that's the problem. Originally, they weren't closely connected, but rivals who fought over wells and pastures. Later, and no one knows exactly when, the various tribes came together to form alliances. These alliances were sealed in an interesting way. What they did was invent a fictive common ancestor to link the tribes. For instance, the Josephites and the Benjaminites formed an alliance and linked their two rival tribes together through the character of Rachel. These stories of various tribes fighting against one another aren't really tales of linked tribes engaging in civil war, but old tales of rival tribes warring with one another before such alliances ever existed. After that small civil war, Jephthah led Israel for 6 years. Then Ibzan took over for the next 7 years. After him, Israel followed Elon, presumably not Musk, for 10 years, and then Abdon for 8 years. And as soon as Abdon died, the Israelites once again returned to paganism, and so Yahweh delivered them into the hands of the Philistines, who ruled over them for the next 40 years, restarting the cycle we're quite familiar with and setting the stage for the most well-known and mythical judge, Samson, who will be the focus of our next episode. Until then, please like us on Facebook at facebook.com/dragonsandgenesis, where you can send me any questions or comments. Subscribe and give us a good review on iTunes or wherever you find your podcasts. And as always, thank you for listening.